Welcome back, guys. It's me, Tony, and we're back with Back to the Future Week. And guess what today is? According to Back to the Future Part 2, we are now in the future. Boy, does it blow. Let's talk about Back to the Future 2. So, Back to the Future 2, the backstory behind that was a little more interesting. Following Back to the Future 1's release, Back to the Future was a huge success at the box office. It became the top grossing film of 1985 with $285 million worldwide. So Universal obviously was going to make sequels. And they did the smart thing as opposed to many other studios where they would just make the sequels without the original creator's intent or without many of the original actors. They asked Bob Gale and Bob Zemeckis if they wanted to come back to make this. And to Universal's surprise, they said yes. But they said yes if we can only get majority of the original cast back together. And that's what they actually did. They got majority of the cast back together with the exception of one person. That being Crispin Glover, who decided not to come back because he wanted... Supposedly there are two different stories to this. Crispin's story is that, he wanted to break out into different roles and not be stuck to typecasting. Gale and Zemeckis' point of view on the whole controversy is that he wanted more money. Whose side I believe, I really don't know. They both tell very convincing arguments. I guess Glover actually had more of a shocking story behind his where they actually talked about using his old prosthetic face to put on the new actor. Eerie. So the production on Back to the Future 2 started in 1986. And Bob Gale ended up writing the sequels because Bob Zemeckis was off working on Who Framed Roger Rabbit for Disney, which didn't get released till 1988. So, while Zemeckis was working on Roger Rabbit, Gale was working on Back to the Future 2 and Back to the Future 3. Because his original plan for Back to the Future 2 was to be this 4-hour epic that was going to chronicle 2 and 3. And I kind of find that a really surprising concept. I could have seen that as just one giant sequel to a successful movie, but I guess Universal at the time realized that was going to cost a lot of money. Here's our suggestion. Either you cut down on what would have been the fourth act, or aka part 3, or split the movie into two, which is what they ended up doing, splitting the movie into two. Some other things that kind of came and went was, originally, the movie wasn't going to have Marty and Doc go back to the first film. The original idea was actually for them to go back to the 60s. But that idea didn't work out because Gale realized, well, we kind of already did that story with Back to the Future 1. Speaking of which, let's get to the plot of Back to the Future 2. Back to the Future 2 takes place where Back to the Future 1 left off. And for many of you who don't know what Back to the Future 1 ended with, Marty went back to 1985, realized that because of his influences to his father and his mother, he changed history. Biff now works for them, and George is a successful writer, and Lorraine a happy mother. And Marty got the car he wanted, and Jennifer showed up, and everything was all happy, hunky-dory, until Doc showed up at the end, telling Marty they needed to go to the future. According to Zemeckis and Gale, by the way, that was supposed to be a joke. They never intended for that to set up Back to the Future 2, because if they did, well, Jennifer wouldn't have been in the sequels. So Doc, Marty, and Jennifer end up getting into the DeLorean and get sent to 2015. When they get to 2015, Doc instantly knocks out Jennifer, so she has nothing to do with the entire mission, so she doesn't end up compromising anything. As soon as Jennifer's knocked out, Doc explains to Marty that his son, Marty Jr., is actually planning to join Biff's grandson, Griff, in committing a crime. And Doc must go back to take his son's place in order to make sure it doesn't happen, because his entire family will end up in jeopardy because of that. And what I mean by his entire family, I mean his future generations. So Marty agrees with the plan and ends up dressing up as his son, Marty McFly Jr. He goes into the Cafe 80s, ends up housing it with Biff after playing Wild Gunman, by the way, with Elijah Wood. Pretty cool. Hoverboard chase. Griff and his gang get thrown in jail. They change history. Marty decides to be a complete a-hole and ends up buying a sports almanac from 2015 so that he can go back in time and bet it on all these sporting events and make a lot of money. Doc warns him about the consequences of changing history and instantly throws out the sports almanac that Marty bought. Biff ends up getting his hands on it and finds out that Doc invented the time machine. So, while Marty and Doc go off to save Jennifer, who got apprehended by police and sent back to Marty's house, Biff steals the DeLorean and goes back in time to give himself the almanac, basically to change history. So when Marty, Doc, and Jennifer go back to 1985, they realize 1985 has changed. And with this alternate 1985, Biff has controlled power and has been married to Lorraine and is now Marty's stepdad. With all of that said, Marty and Doc do find out eventually that Biff ended up giving himself the almanac in 1955. So this means the characters have to go back to the first movie. So, after dropping Jennifer off, Doc and Marty decide to go back to 1955 and end up having to revisit all the old events that happened from the first film, along with creating some new ones. Marty tries throughout the entire film to get Biff and get back the almanac, but Biff is a hard guy to crack. Eventually Marty does get back the almanac, he eventually burns it, and they all have a big celebratory ending. That is until Doc gets struck by lightning. Doc gets struck by lightning and is sent somewhere through time. Marty has no clue where, that is until he gets a letter from a Western Union man. The letter states that Doc has been sent back to 1885 and that he's doing fine and well. Marty is reassured of this and realizes that there's only one way he can get back home, which is going back and convincing the Doc from 1955 to give him a hand in looking for a DeLorean to send him back. That's Back to the Future 2 in a nutshell. Many people have mixed feelings on this movie, and I can understand why. On one hand, it's not that bad of a sequel, but on the other hand, the plot is way too complicated, and there's just a lot going on that no one will really follow, especially if you watch the first one. I remember the first time I watched it, I was sitting there going, it kind of felt a little shorter than the first one. Like, the first one was almost 2 hours, but this one kind of felt like an hour and a half. And to be surprising, it's also 2 hours, but it just feels shorter. That's maybe because the plot moves a little more quickly in this one than it did in the first one. But that's probably just my observations. How do I feel about the movie? I have nothing against it. I actually really enjoy it. Is it up there with the first one? Not really. Not really. I mean, it has its problems, but it also has its highlights too. I love their depiction of the future, especially for how wrong it is. Seriously, folks, why do we not have flying cars or hoverboards? What the fuck? But I will give them kudos for this. They found a way to throw in some Roger Rabbit jokes. Yes, once Robert Zemeckis got back from working on Who Framed Roger Rabbit in the winter of 1988, they decided that because they were still in production of Back to the Future 2, they were going to throw in some Roger Rabbit cameos. So Roger Rabbit has a cameo in 2015, and actually the character actor who played Roger Rabbit, Charles Fleischer, has 2 cameos in the film playing a character named Terry, who I actually have to say is probably one of my favorites in this entire movie. With this said, though, do I hate it? No, I don't hate it. I don't hate this movie at all. Does everyone else hate it? Kind of. They've now seen it as just a cult classic, but it's still kind of hated. With this said, guys, join us tomorrow where we'll be discussing the end of the trilogy. With this said, guys, see you next time.